honourable friend for promoting the government's call for evidence on tackling violence against women and girls. We are asking the public, victims, charities, employers, health professionals, universities, colleges, the armed forces, the NHS and many more for their views so that we can develop a national strategy that is fit for the 2020s. This is the largest ever call for evidence on crimes that disproportionately affect women and girls, because we want to hear from all parts of society. And Mr. Speaker, I ask all honourable members to play their part and encourage their constituents to contribute to this vital call for evidence before it closes on the 19th of February.
We now have the Shadow Secretary, Marcia de Cordova. Marcia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Asians in particular, Bangladeshi and Pakistani people are still experiencing 3 times the risk from coronavirus in this second wave. Therefore, take-up of the vaccine is vital. We know that historical issues of mistrust and culturally inappropriate public health information has contributed to the legitimate vaccine hesitancy. The government has had time to plan to mitigate for this, but has still not produced a clear strategy to engage with our Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities. Can I ask the Minister what steps she has taken to ensure vaccine rollout reaches all our communities, particularly those who are unequally impacted?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will be providing a second COVID disparities report at the end of this month, which will provide more comprehensive detail of steps that we have taken. However, this is an issue that we recognise is very serious. The disparities are changing for different groups. We have seen some progress, for instance, amongst Black groups. However, we do emphasise that vaccines are the best way to protect people from coronavirus. The Department of Health and the NHS are working closely with Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities to support those receiving a vaccine and help anyone who may have questions about the process. As part of this, we're working with faith and community leaders to give them advice and information about the universal benefits of vaccination and how their communities can get a vaccine.
Now the second question from Marcia Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has failed to consider the impact on equalities resulting from its responses to the pandemic. COVID mortality rates are twice as high in deprived areas, and the lowest paid are more than twice as likely to have lost their jobs. This is why the government has a legal duty, as set out in the Equality Act, to consider the effects of policies on inequality, whether ministers would agree or not. As the Minister for Women and Equality has yet to reply to my letter dated on the 14th of January, can she now say that she will work to ensure all government departments undertake and publish equality impact assessments on all its responses to this pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I completely reject the Honourable Lady's assertions. We do have a strategy, and one part of that strategy is to ensure that ethnic minorities are not stigmatised. The issues around coronavirus are complex. We have released information in various reports that show what the risk factors are, and we have also outlined a plan to address them.
We have the final question from Mark Menzies up in Lancashire. Mark Menzies.
Mr. Speaker, there is growing concern that an increasing number of women are becoming victims of online gambling addiction, with resulting financial and mental health issues. What steps is the government taking to truly understand the scale of the problem and to safeguard women from predatory recruitment tactics?
Mr. Speaker, rates of problem gambling amongst women do remain very low, but we know how devastating its impacts can be. The Gambling Commission is looking at the way it collects data on gambling participation and problem gambling to make sure we have access to even more robust and regular data on the issue. The government is also reviewing the Gambling Act to make sure we have the right protections in place to make gambling safer for all.
Right, thank you for that. We are now coming to Prime Minister's questions, where I'm going to be calling... Prime Minister, come on, let's be having you. Gurry Sambrook's waiting. Gurry Sambrook.
Go on, sir. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Gurry Sambrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last week, thousands of people across Frankly Great Park and South Northfield have done what's been asked of them to go and get a test because of a small number of South African variant cases
in the constituency. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking Dr Justin Varney and Councillor Simon Morrell and Birmingham City Council for everything they've done to be able to scale up mass testing across Frankfurt Great Park, and encourage anyone who hasn't had a test so far to get one at one of the designated sites?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for raising it, and I join him in thanking the NHS staff who are scaling up the surge testing in the way that he describes, and I encourage everybody in the area, and indeed throughout the country, to get a vaccine when you're asked to do so.
Let's come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by thanking everybody involved in the vaccine rollout? We've now vaccinated, I think, 12.6 million people, and we're on course to vaccinate the first 4 priority groups by the end of this week. That's a truly amazing achievement. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that the government will extend business rate relief beyond March 31st?
I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear him join in praise of the vaccine rollout, which is indeed, I think, a tribute to the NHS staff and the Army, the volunteers, and many, many others. And on his point about the extension of business rate relief, he knows that this government is committed to supporting businesses and people, livelihoods throughout the pandemic. That is what we will continue to do, but he should wait until the budget for the Chancellor to explain exactly what we're going to do.
Mr. Speaker, I think that answer was that the Prime Minister can't give an answer yet. But hundreds of thousands of businesses are affected by this. And the trouble is, Mr. Speaker, that businesses don't work as slowly as the Prime Minister. They need an answer now. As the British Chamber of Commerce says, businesses simply can't wait until the March budget. Let me try another vitally important question for businesses and for millions of working people. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that the furlough scheme will be extended beyond April?
Mr. Speaker, I think most people in this country are aware that we're going through a very serious pandemic in which rates of infection have been steadily brought down thanks to the efforts of the rich people. I think also members of this House are familiar with the notion that in just a few days we will be setting out a roadmap for the way out of this pandemic, a roadmap that I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues will support. Though the support, as we know, tends to be a transitory thing, Mr. Speaker. One week we have it, the next week we don't. But he won't have to contain himself for very long.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me let the Prime Minister into a secret. He can take decisions for himself, and he doesn't need to leave everything to the 11th minute. If I were Prime Minister, I'd say to businesses, we'll support you now. We'll protect jobs now. Because the CBI, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Institute of Directors and the British Chamber of Commerce have all said the same thing. They all say, Prime Minister, they can't wait until the budget. The Prime Minister may disagree with me, but he's actually disagreeing with businesses. Why does the Prime Minister think he knows better than British business?
Mr. Speaker, I think that most business people that I've talked to a great many in the last 12 months, would agree that there is no government around the world that has done more to support business, wrapping our arms around business. And actually, I'm delighted to hear this enthusiasm for business from the Labour Party when they stood on a manifesto to destroy capitalism at the last election, and indeed to dismantle the very pharmaceutical industry, Mr. Speaker, that has provided the vaccines on which we now rely. Will he now repudiate that policy, Mr. Speaker?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, we all know what the Prime Minister once said he wanted to do to business. We on these benches would rather listen to businesses. So we've no decision on business rates, no decision on furlough. Let's try another crucial issue. And Prime Minister, no excuse for delaying this time, because this has to be decided before the March budget, and the Prime Minister doesn't need to check with the Chancellor. So will the Prime Minister now commit to extending the evictions ban on residential properties beyond February the 21st?
Mr. Speaker, I've said repeatedly that what we will do in this government and throughout this pandemic is put our arms around the British people, support them throughout the pandemic, and make sure that people are not unfairly evicted during the pandemic. That is what we will do. What I hope very much, Mr. Speaker, is that we may hear from the right honourable gentleman opposite that he not only has now had a Damascene conversion to the importance of business, but a Damascene conversion to supporting all the government's policies to support businesses, rather than sniping from the sidelines. Why doesn't he just get behind us and back the government, back us in our efforts to back business and back the British people?
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take lectures from a man who wrote 2 versions of every column he ever wrote as a journalist, who proposed Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize and gave Dominic Cummings a pay rise. Back to the question. Another area where the Prime Minister repeatedly delayed and now changes policy pretty well every day is securing our borders against variants of COVID. Every week the Prime Minister comes here and says we've got one of the toughest regimes in the world. We know his Home Secretary disagrees with him. We know the Health Secretary disagrees with him. Luckily, Mr. Speaker, Oxford University keep track of how tough border restrictions are in every country. They say that there are at least 33 countries around the world which currently have tougher restrictions for the United Kingdom. 33, Prime Minister, including Canada, Denmark, Japan, Israel. There are many others. In fact, they say we're not even in the top bracket of countries for border restrictions. 50 days after we first discovered the South African variant, 50 days. How does the Prime Minister explain that?
Mr. Speaker, there are some countries in Europe that do not even have a hotel quarantine scheme such as the one we're putting in on Monday. We have amongst the toughest border regimes anywhere in the world. And people should understand that on a normal day, Mr. Speaker, at this time of year, you could expect about 250,000 people to be arriving in this country. We've got it down to about 20,000, 5,000 of them whom are involved in bringing vital things into this country, such as medicines and food, as we discussed last week, and he agreed that was a good idea, Mr. Speaker. Unless he actually wants to cut this country off from the rest of the world, which I think last week he said he didn't want to do, unless, of course, he's changed his mind again, Mr. Speaker. I think that this policy is measured, it is proportionate, it is getting tougher from Monday. I hope that he supports it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is this. The Prime Minister is failing to give security to British businesses, and he's failing to secure our borders. The Prime Minister often complains that we never put forward constructive proposals. So here's 2 for him. Support businesses and protect jobs now by extending furlough, business rate relief and VAT cuts for hospitality. And second, secure our borders with a comprehensive hotel quarantine on arrival. No more delays. Will he do it?
Mr. Speaker, we've just announced the quarantine policy, which, as I've said to the House, is amongst the toughest in the world and tougher than most other European countries, certainly. I'm delighted that he's now supporting business in his latest stunt of bandwagoneering, not a policy for which he was famous before, Mr. Speaker. But he moves from one side of the other in the debate throughout this crisis. And some people, Mr. Speaker, some people have said that this is a good crisis, Mr. Speaker. Some people have said this is a good crisis. Some people have said that this crisis is a gift that keeps on giving, Mr. Crisis. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, those people sit on the Labour front bench. I think it is disgraceful that they should say those things. I believe this is one of the biggest challenges this country has faced since the Second World War. And thanks to one of the fastest vaccine rollouts anywhere in the world, I believe it is a challenge this country can meet and is meeting. And I believe that of that vaccine rollout programme, this House and this country should be very proud.
Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for the decisions he took last year that have meant that the vaccine programme is in such a good position this week. Despite that success, it is vital that that programme keeps pace with the changing variants. Can he update the House on where the UK stands on ensuring that the UK supply chain is in place and that we don't get behind as the virus mutates?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend asked an extremely important question, and that's why we recently announced an agreement for 50 million doses with the manufacturer CureVac, because we believe that that may help us to develop vaccines that can respond at scale to new variants of the virus. And as the House will have heard from the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and others, I think we're going to have to get used to the idea of vaccinating and then revaccinating in the autumn as we come to face these new variants.
Let's head up to Skye and Lochaber with SNP leader Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the baby bank charity Little Village has revealed that 1.3 million children under 5 are living in poverty in the United Kingdom. This is a truly shocking figure that should make this Tory government utterly ashamed. The Scottish National Party has repeatedly called for a financial package to boost household incomes and reverse this Tory child poverty crisis. The Prime Minister has the power to tackle child poverty right now by making the £20 uplift to universal credit permanent and by extending it to legacy benefits. The Tory government's been stalling on this for months. Will the Prime Minister finally act, or will he leave millions of children out in the cold?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House in this country should be proud of the way we've tried to look after people, the poorest and neediest families throughout the country, not just with universal credit, which the party opposite would actually abolish, Mr. Speaker, but by helping vulnerable people with their food and their heating bills, the £170 million winter grant scheme, looking after people with the free school meal vouchers. And as I've said before, Mr. Speaker, we will put our arms around the people of this entire country throughout the pandemic.
Let's return to Scotland with Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that was pathetic. That was no answer. We're talking about 1.3 million children under 5 in poverty. Let me quote, "She cried on her doorstep because I gave her nappies, wipes and winter clothes for her child. I went away with a lump in my throat." These are the words of Emily, a baby bank worker who's supporting families that the Tories have pushed into poverty through a decade of cuts. They don't need more empty words from a Prime Minister who simply doesn't care enough to act. Mr. Speaker, this morning a new report from Citizen Advice Scotland warned that Tory cuts could reduce the value of universal credit by as much as a quarter just when people need this money the most. Will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me and other opposition parties ahead of the budget for an urgent summit on tackling child poverty, or will he be yet another Tory Prime Minister who leaves a generation of children languishing in poverty?
Mr. Speaker, I must say that I reject entirely what the Right Honourable Gentleman has just said, because I don't believe that any government could have done more to help the people of this country throughout this pandemic, and we will continue to do so. And yes, of course, we bitterly lament and reject the poverty that some families unquestionably suffer. And it is tragic that too many families have had a very, very tough time during this pandemic. But we will continue to support them in all the ways that we have set up. And I may say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, there is a profound philosophical difference between him and me. Because the Scottish Nationalist Party is morphing into ever more a left-wing party that believes fundamentally. There you go, Mr. Speaker. That believes fundamentally that it is the duty of the taxpayer to pay for more and more and more. We want to get people into jobs, Mr. Speaker, and it is in that respect that the Scottish Nationalist Party is, I'm afraid, failing their...
Well, Prime Minister, we both know that you're only teasing him and we're trying to wind up the leader of the SNP. Please, let's drop it. Let's move on, because Lee Anderson is waiting for you. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new Freeport for the East Midlands will create over 60,000 new jobs and provide a massive boost for employers such as Cornton Engineering and Abacus in Ashfield. After decades of neglect from Labour MPs, we now feel a sense of hope in the red wall seats. My mum and dad voted Conservative for the first time at the last general election and were touched when the Prime Minister acknowledged their votes were lent. Could my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, please reassure my mum and dad, my friend, my family and all my constituents that our area will never be let down again.
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for everything he's doing for Ashfield, and he and I have had enjoyable times campaigning for the people of Ashfield, and we'll continue to do so. And I can tell Paul and Jenny that our commitment to levelling up is absolutely rock solid throughout this country.
I said to marry on it with Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. We've just heard the government claims to have a levelling up agenda, underpinned by a research and development roadmap. The trouble is, the Tories' track record on this isn't good. In fact, it's abysmal. Wales receives the lowest R&D spend per person of the four nations, at around 40% of spend per head in England. And Westminster's obsession with the golden triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London shows no sign of abating. Will he now commit to a fairer, devolved R&D funding settlement to the Senedd? Or is he content for Westminster's roadmap to be Wales's road to nowhere?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I think she's doing Wales down, and the people of Wales down, and the ingenuity of Wales down, because I think about a quarter of the airline passengers in the world are borne aloft on wings made by the Welsh aerospace sector, Mr. Speaker. Bridgend is going to be one of the great centres of battery manufacturing in this country, if not the world. Wales is at the cutting edge of technology under this government's plans for a record spending on R&D, £22 billion by the end of this Parliament. Wales, along with the whole of the rest of the UK, will benefit massively.
Let's head to Cheshire with Dr. Kieran Mullen. Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has fallen behind Europe in untapping the potential of geothermal heat and energy in places like Crewe. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can ensure geothermal better with a
I thank my honourable friend for the excellent point he makes about Crewe and the way it's of deep geothermal energy exploration, and very happy to what we can do to further geothermal energy in Crewe, Durry permitting, Mr. Speaker.
Let's wander up to Bolton with Yasmin Qureshi. Yasmin.
Mr. Speaker, this government said that no council would be suffering as a result of the pandemic. And the Chancellor said that he would do everything, whatever it takes to help them. Yet the Tory-controlled Bolton Council has just announced 35 million cuts in pounds and an increase in the council tax budget for 3.8%. Can the Prime Minister assure my constituents and my town that that money will be given to them, or will this join a long list of Tory failed promises?
Minister.
I want to congratulate, Mr. Speaker, the great Conservative-controlled Council of Bolton for everything they're doing and continue to do throughout this pandemic to look after the people of Bolton. I know what incredible work local officials do, and I thank them very much for it. And we believe, since we believe so strongly in local government, Mr. Speaker, as a creature of local government myself, I'm proud that we've invested £4.6 billion in supporting local government just so far in this pandemic.
Sajid Javid.
Mr. Speaker, from rainforests to coral reefs, the world's ecosystems are at risk of catastrophic decline. That was the conclusion of the Dasgupta review last week, which my right honourable friend rightly welcomed. This threat to our biodiversity is not just a moral failure, it is economically short-sighted too. When I asked Professor Dasgupta to carry out this work, he told me that it would not be complete until after the UK had hosted the COP26 summit. But now, given that the summit has been delayed until later this year, and that it will take place alongside our presidency of the G7, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK has been presented with a unique opportunity to show global leadership on how we can better protect our most precious asset, nature?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. And I thank him for what he's doing himself in this area. And I want the House to know that we want our COP, the UN COP26 summit, to be a landmark event, not just for tackling climate change, but also in biodiversity. And I think it's high time that the leaders of the world took a step to reverse the loss of habitats and species that we've seen over the last century.
Let's head up to Oxfordshire with Layla Moran. Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's estimated that up to 400,000 people are living with the debilitating effects of long COVID, and some of these are NHS heroes who caught COVID in that first wave. Nearly a year later, I've heard from a doctor who says she wonders if she'll ever be able to walk unaided again, let alone manage a full day of work. Does the Prime Minister recognise that for this group, long COVID is an occupational disease? And will he set up a compensation scheme similar to what we offer our armed forces, so that we ensure that those who have lost their livelihoods by saving lives are fully supported?
Thank the honourable lady, because she's right to highlight the incredible sacrifice and effort of NHS staff, many of whom sadly have contracted COVID in the course of their duties, and a great many of whom have sadly continued to be affected by that disease. We must study the long-term effects of COVID and make sure that we continue to look after our wonderful NHS staff throughout their careers.
To Yorkshire with Julian Sturdy. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm today that all students will be back in school no later than the 8th of March and commit to starting any phased return straight after half-term, so that the really damaging effects of being away from school are not drawn out for any longer than is absolutely necessary?
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly confirm that we're going to do everything we can, and I know that that's the settled will of most people in this House to get our kids, get school children back on March the 8th, if we possibly can. I'll be setting out for my honourable friend as much as we can say on Monday, and then in the week of the 22nd, we'll be setting out a roadmap and setting out the way forward for schools. But we've got to make sure we keep this virus under control, Mr. Speaker. It is coming down, but we cannot take our foot off its throat.
Let's head up to the northeast with Ian Mearns. Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Having sat on the HS2 Hybrid Bill Committee for 15 months, I was a sceptic as to the economic benefits of the project for the northeast. But HS2 is going ahead, at least in the south. It's therefore crucial that the eastern leg of HS2 goes ahead, not just for Yorkshire and the East Midlands, but also for the northeast. The Prime Minister has made repeated promises to the people of the northeast of his intention to level up and to connect and create opportunities for people here in places like Gateshead. So as we strive to recover from the damage done to so many families and businesses by the pandemic, will the Prime Minister commit to beginning the work on the eastern leg of HS2, starting in the northeast, to run simultaneously with the construction in the south, so that our region is not forced to wait another couple of decades for 21st century rail connectivity?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly confirm that we are going to develop the eastern leg as well as the whole of HS2, and he'll be hearing a lot more about what we're going to do with our national infrastructure revolution, Mr. Speaker, and about what we're going to do to improve not just rail transport, but road transport as well in the northeast.
Let's head south to Caroline Nance, who's audio only. Caroline Nance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no shortage of commitment or compassion in my town of Eastbourne for homeless people who are vulnerable and need complex support. However, neighbouring Brighton continues to send its homeless to our town, and we do not have the resources to meet this need. 3 homeless people have died, and I believe there will be inquests. Brighton is not engaging with Eastbourne's council in any meaningful way, and a further 51 placements have been made in recent weeks. Will my right honourable friend join with me in urging immediate engagement from Brighton and Hove council leaders on this as a matter of urgency?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Brighton Council and East for cooperating with Eastbourne Council in getting this done. There must be cooperation. No one in this country should be living rough or sleeping or homeless, sleeping rough or being homeless as a result of this pandemic, or indeed through any other cause, Mr. Speaker. We've invested 700 million this year to help people off the streets. It continues to be a national priority, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, for what he's doing and the various task forces that are currently at work to prevent people coming out on the streets again as we lift the restrictions.
Let's head to South Wales with Geraint Davis. Geraint.
Mr. Speaker, at DVLA in Swansea, there'd been 526 cases of coronavirus since last September, when the Prime Minister told us, at Prime Minister's Question Time, all staff who can work from home are working from home. Yet in March last year, 250 people were working on site. Now the numbers are in their thousands, facing a more infectious and widespread disease. And yesterday, 90 people were sent home following the latest outbreak of coronavirus just before the weekend. So given that BT are on standby to install home secure technology to allow home working, will the Prime Minister meet with me and the union PCS ahead of the strike ballot next week so that workplace numbers can be reduced until the vaccine is rolled out to keep people safe and to avoid an unnecessary strike?
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for raising this again with me, and thanks to the working from home strategy that DVLA has been pursuing of a workforce of 6,000. There are currently thankfully, there are only 9 cases, to the best of my knowledge, of COVID, and 3 of those individuals are currently working from home. We're rolling out lateral flow tests. A huge number of lateral flow tests are being distributed to the DVLA. But the long-term solution, Mr. Speaker, or the medium-term solution, I should say, is to vaccinate and to roll out the vaccination programme. And that is what this government is doing in Wales and across the country.
Let's head to the West Midlands with Nicola Richards. Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Families across West Bromwich East have been affected by cancer, just like my own, and know all too well that early diagnosis and treatment can save a life. According to research by Macmillan Cancer Support, there were over 70 people in my constituency and 50,000 across the UK with a missing cancer diagnosis. Cancer hasn't stopped during the pandemic, so with this in mind, will the Prime Minister commit to making the resurgence of cancer diagnosis services a top priority as restrictions begin to ease?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I know this is an issue that is very close to her heart, and she's right to raise it, because we, of course, there are the pressures from COVID, but we're also worried, Mr. Speaker, that some people may not be coming forward for the cancer treatments that they need. So I'd urge everybody who needs to get their treatment to help the NHS to help you come forward and get your treatment as you normally would.
To the northwest with Lucy Powell. Lucy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said in November that the £1.5 billion Green Homes grant would be extended to March 2022. Yet in a written answer last week, his minister said that the money would not be carried over from this financial year to next. With just 7 weeks to go, a paltry £71 million has been spent so far. So why is he cutting £1 billion from the Green Homes grant that he promised for businesses, homeowners and the environment?
She's on to something, but she's barking up the wrong tree, Mr. Speaker. The problem with the Green Homes grant is not that we're not cutting it. The problem is there hasn't been enough take up, and we want to encourage people to take it up and make use of the opportunity to reduce the carbon emission of your homes.
Let's head south to Sir Roger Gale. Sir Roger.
The Prime Minister has said, and he's written in his foreword to the Environment White Paper, that he's pledged to protect the countryside. Mr. Speaker, the countryside is more than just a bit of green belt around the home counties. In Westgate and Birchington and Herne Bay, in my own constituency, and indeed across much of the Garden of England, there are plans to smother acres of prime agricultural land in housing that is not needed for local people, but that is needed and required to grow the crops to reduce the amount of food that we import at a cost of carbon emissions. So if the Prime Minister is the friend of the countryside, will he announce an immediate moratorium on the use of all farmland for housing while the whole policy is reviewed?
Mr. Speaker, I think I just heard the honourable gentleman say that he wants an immediate moratorium on the construction of all housing. Maybe I misunderstood. I don't think that to be realistic. But what I can certainly tell him is that we will take very seriously the points he makes. I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, has met him and will be glad to meet him again to discuss the subject he raises. But this government's commitment to nature and to the countryside is unmatched. We've just consecrated 30% of our land surface, Mr. Speaker, to nature.
Let's head up to Airdrie with Neil Gray. Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a meeting recently with the PCS about public sector pay and heard from constituents in Shotts and Calderbank who work for UK government departments. Both are struggling to cover over a real terms pay cut over decades. One has had to take partial early retirement so the lump sum could keep him going. What will the Prime Minister say to the Chancellor to convince him of the need to properly reward all those who have been on the front line during the COVID pandemic and at the very least follow the Scottish Government's lead in fully funding a rise in public sector pay?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen above inflation increases in public sector pay, and that is quite right. And we support particularly increases in investment in our NHS, and you'll know the package that we put in place for nurses. But the single best thing that we can do is support the living wage, which this government introduced, and which this government introduced, and which we have now increased by record amounts 2 years in a row. And I see the Scottish Nationalist Party, forgive me, Mr. Speaker, the National. I don't know whether they're nationalists or not. Perhaps they could clear it up. Whether they think, maybe are they?
It's up earlier for you.
Are they a national party without being nationalists? It's an interesting semantic point, Mr. Speaker. I think they're trying to claim that they pioneered the living wage. I don't think that's right, Mr. Speaker. I seem to remember that it was a certain mayoralty in London that massively increased the living wage when they weren't off the starting blocks, Mr. Speaker.
In which case, let's go down to Somerset, who is ready on the starting blocks with Ian Littlegranger.
Mr. Speaker, thank you as always. I am delighted my honourable friend is defending democracy by pushing ahead with local elections. But here in the land of King Alfred, the people desperately want to give their verdict on Somerset County Council, which I'm afraid has been using COVID money to spend on things that have nothing to do with the pandemic. They have submitted to the government a form which says that nothing, and I fear that my right honourable friend has been misled. We need a referendum down here to test public opinion quickly. But would my right honourable friend, a proud man of Somerset, who understands history more than most of us, not agree the time has come to put our county back together and that we have the whole of Somerset being looked after by Somerset? I know King Alfred would approve of it, and I know the people of Somerset will certainly support the Prime Minister if he supports us.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, who is a great advocate of Somerset and committed to his constituents, and I thank him for what he's doing. He's raised this now twice with me, and I thank him for that. But my humbly suggest that the best way forward is for the consultation to proceed and for local people to decide what the best form of government, local government, is that they want.
Let's head for our final question from Northern Ireland with Gregory Campbell. Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, you're aware now of the problems we warned about over many months before the Northern Ireland Protocol was introduced. These problems are scheduled to get worse from April. Can you outline a timeline where people in Northern Ireland, and indeed all across the UK, as indicated in the Parliament petition last week, when all of us can enjoy free trade across the nation, including from GB to NI, as every other independent trading nation enjoys.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I've made it absolutely clear to our EU friends and partners that we want to make our relationship work, but it is also absolutely essential that there should be untrammeled free trade exchange of goods, people, services and capital through all parts of the UK, and we will do everything we can to ensure that that is the case, including, as I've said in the chamber before, and to his honourable colleagues, including invoking Article 16 of the Protocol if that is necessary.
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Ready? Liz, are you ready? OK. I now call the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, to make a statement. Secretary of State.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I want to make a statement on housing and building safety. Beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, the government wants to build back better. Better homes, better infrastructure, and better communities. But the foundations of these ambitions and the mission of my department are safety and fairness. We've all been moved by the stories we've heard and the people that we've met, homeowners, placed in difficult, sometimes impossible situations through no fault of their own. I appreciate the frustration, the worry, and at times the despair that they feel. I share their anger at the errors, the omissions, the false promises, and even the outright dishonesty that came before us, built up over many decades, but which this government is determined to tackle. That's why, Mr. Speaker, today I'm announcing an unprecedented intervention, a clear plan to remove unsafe cladding, to provide certainty to leaseholders, to make the industry pay for its faults of the past, to create a world-class building safety regime, and to inject confidence and certainty back into this part of the housing market. Firstly, we will finish the job that we've started on remediating unsafe cladding. After the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, the expert advice that this government received identified aluminium composite cladding, ACM, the material on the tower, as by far the most unsafe form of cladding. It should never have been used, and our independent expert advisory panel recommended that this should be the focus of our remediation work. Thanks to a very considerable effort, including during the pandemic, almost 95% of all high-rise buildings identified by the beginning of last year with unsafe ACM cladding have now been remediated, or workers are on site now doing the job, and that rises to 100% in social housing. And guided again by expert advice, the work to remove other types of cladding, which are also unsafe, albeit less so than ACM, where it poses a genuine risk to life, is also underway. It was always our expectation, our demand, that building owners and developers should step up to meet the cost of this work. Where they haven't, or where they no longer exist, the government has stepped in, providing £1.6 billion to remediate unsafe cladding. However, it's clear that without further government intervention, many building owners will simply seek to pass these potentially very significant costs on to leaseholders, as this is often the legal position in the leases that they signed. That would risk punishing those who've worked hard, who've bought their own home, but through no fault of their own have found themselves caught in an absolutely invidious situation. Importantly, it also risks slowing down the critical works to make these homes safer. I am therefore today making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England. We continue to take a safety-led approach, and this funding will focus on the higher-rise buildings where the independent expert advisory panel tells us, time and again, the overwhelming majority of the safety risk lies, in line with the existing Building Safety Fund and the anticipated scope of the new building safety regulator that we're establishing and will shortly be legislating for. This will ensure that we end the cladding scandal in a way that is fair and generous to leaseholders. Secondly, for lower and medium-rise blocks of flats, the risks are significantly lower, and the remediation of cladding is less likely to be needed. In many cases, it will not be needed at all. But where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why I'm announcing today that the government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term, low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less. Taken together, this means the government is providing more than £5 billion, including a further £3.5 billion announced today, plus the significant cost of the very generous financing scheme, which will run for many years to come, to ensure all leaseholders in medium and high-rise blocks face no costs or very low costs if cladding remediation is needed. Where it is, costs can still be significant for leaseholders, which is why we want to take these important steps. We want to ensure that the government develops this long-term scheme which will protect leaseholders with financial support. Taken together, this means that the government helps leaseholders to move forwards with greater certainty and more confidence about the future. Thirdly, whilst the problem is not one of leaseholders making, it is also the case that it cannot be right that the costs of addressing these issues fall solely on taxpayers, many of whom are not themselves homeowners and can only dream of getting on the housing ladder. The government has always expected the industry to contribute towards these costs, and some have done so. Today, I'm announcing that we will introduce a gateway to developer levy that will be implemented through the forthcoming Building Safety Bill. The proposed levy will be targeted and only apply when developers seek permission to develop certain high-rise buildings in England, helping to ensure the industry take collective responsibility for historic building safety defects. In introducing the levy, we will continue to ensure the homes our country needs get built and that our small and medium-sized builders are protected. In addition, a new tax will be introduced for the UK residential property development sector in 2022. This will raise at least £2 billion over a decade to help pay for cladding remediation costs. The tax will ensure the largest property developers make a fair contribution to the remediation programme in relation to the money they make from residential property, reflecting the benefit that they will derive from restoring confidence to the UK housing market. The government will consult on the policy design in due course. Fourthly, I know there are many people across the country who are concerned about the safety of their home. In the actions we've taken and those that we take today, we've already prioritised very clearly public safety. However, it's also important that we put the risk of a fire, and in particular, the risk of a fatal fire, into context. It is low. Last year, the number of people who died in fires in blocks of flats over 11 metres was 10, an all-time low. And fire-related fatalities in dwellings in England have fallen by 29% over the last decade. By way of comparison, over 1,700 fatalities were reported on our roads in 2019. Now, of course, any death is one too many, and the tragedy of Grenfell Tower lingers with us and demands action. That's why it's right that we address safety issues where they exist and are a threat to life. but do so in a proportionate way and guided at all times by expert advice. That is the approach we're taking through the Building Safety Bill, the new Building Safety Regulator, the Fire Safety Bill, and the new National Regulator of Construction Products that I announced in January. I'm determined that we have a world-class building safety regime. But lastly, we need everyone to follow this sensible, proportionate approach so that this part of the housing market can now move forwards and homeowners are not disproportionately impacted. The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have consulted on new guidance for valuers on when an EWS1 form should actually be required. The government endorses its work to ensure that assessors have a stronger basis on which to make good, proportionate judgments about valuation risk. Lenders have welcomed the progress on this guidance, which will help ensure that over 500,000 leaseholders in blocks of flats over 11 metres will not need a separate EWS1 assessment to get a mortgage. This builds on the interventions that we've already made to create and train many more assessors, and we're doing so further so that they can access professional indemnity insurance to get on with the job. So today, in addition to providing certainty to leaseholders, we're also providing confidence to lenders. And following discussions my right honourable friend the Chancellor and I have had with the lenders, we expect all of the major banks and building societies to strongly support today's intervention, which will provide greater certainty to the market and help to restore the effective lending, purchasing and selling of properties as soon as possible. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, this exceptional intervention amounts to the largest ever government investment in building safety. We believe in home ownership, and today we firmly support the hundreds of thousands of homeowners who need our help now. I commend this statement to the House.
I will call Thangam Debonnaire, who's participating virtually, who has 6 minutes in which to respond. Thangam Debonnaire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Buying your first home should be a dream come true, but for many it's now been a nightmare for years. As a result of government choices, 3.5 years on from the Grenfell tragedy in which 72 people lost their lives, hundreds of thousands of people are still trapped in unsafe homes, many more unable to move. And today's announcement is too late for too many. It's a repeat of undelivered promises and backtracks on the key one that leaseholders should have no costs to pay. The Chancellor said last March, all unsafe combustible cladding will be removed from every private and social residential building above 18 metres high, but that has not happened. Buildings haven't been able to access the fund, and £9 out of 10 is still sitting where it was. At every stage, the government underestimated the problem and delays caused it to grow. They still don't know how many buildings are unsafe, where they are, or what danger they pose. And until we have answers to those basic questions, government will continue to make mistakes, offering piecemeal solutions that then have to be updated when they don't deliver. So I ask, can the Secretary of State guarantee the funding will cover all buildings over 18 metres? What will the consequential be for the devolved administrations, including Wales? We can't have a repeat of the first come, first served free-for-all, where the most dangerous blocks risk being fixed last. So will the government set up an independent task force, as Labour has asked for, to prioritise buildings according to risk, have powers to get the funds out of the door and to be able to go after the building owners who fail to get on with the work? Government ministers have now promised 17 times that leaseholders will not bear the cost of fixing a problem they didn't cause. Many will be listening to the Housing Secretary's remarks today, and the government has betrayed their promise that leaseholders wouldn't pay for the building safety crisis. As I said, 3.5 years on from Grenfell, hundreds of thousands can't sleep at night because their homes are unsafe. The government has chosen today to pile financial misery on them. This is an injustice. What does the Housing Secretary say to Julie in Runcorn, who lives in a flat with dangerous HPL cladding? Her block is under 18 metres, so she's unable to access funding promised so far. She lives in the same development as buildings with the exact same cladding, but over 18 metres, so they will be able to access the fund. Why should this arbitrary 18-metre height limit mean the difference between a safe home and financial ruin? What are the terms of the loans? What will the interest rate be? And will leaseholders be required to pay the interest as well as the main cost? And he says leaseholders won't pay more than £50 a month. Does that stay with the current owners when they move, or with the home if the new owner is forced to pay? How long does it run for? Will it go up by inflation each year? And what will government do if those homes remain unsellable? How will they ensure that freeholders take up the loans? How will government speed up remediation? Because the current stalemate cannot continue. And then there are others who don't have dangerous cladding but have been charged hundreds of thousands of pounds, thousands of pounds per flat to fix other fire safety issues. What does the Housing Secretary say to them? The government should focus on securing our economy and rebuilding from COVID, not saddling homeowners with further debt. When they have further debt, that means less money for our economic recovery, taking money away from local shops. It reinforces regional imbalances, and it makes young first-time buyers and pensioners pay money they can't afford. The government should pursue those responsible fully to prevent leaseholders and taxpayers from carrying the can. The government has announced a levy and a tax, which I welcome because those responsible should bear the cost. But how much does the government anticipate this levy will raise? And will the government pursue others, such as cladding manufacturers, also responsible for putting the dangerous cladding? Government has missed every target for removing ACM cladding, and there are still 50,000 people living in flats wrapped in it. The same cladding as found on Grenfell Tower, thousands more with other dangerous cladding. So will the Minister commit today to remove all dangerous cladding by 2022? As the Secretary of State will know, at least one first-time homeowner, Hayley, has already been made bankrupt before she was even asked to pay for remediation, just from the extra costs. She asked government to think about her former neighbours. When will leaseholders start receiving funding to pay for the round-the-clock fire patrols they've been charged hundreds of pounds each month for? What about the skyrocketing insurance? And how will government get the market moving? And their last announcement fell to pieces. The housing market in affected homes is grinding to a halt. And a simple question, what on average does he expect the leaseholder to be paying? Mr. Speaker, finally, government inaction and delay has caused the building safety crisis to spiral. People cannot continue to live in unsafe, unsellable homes. Homeowners shouldn't face bankruptcy to fix a problem they didn't cause. Unfortunately, these proposals will still leave too many people struggling and facing loans instead of being given justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that the Honourable Lady welcomes many of the proposals we've set out today. This is an unprecedented intervention, and it's one of the most generous, if not the most generous of its kind, anywhere in the world. She asks, importantly, why have we focused on high-rise buildings? Because that is time and again where all the independent expert advice leads us. We must make these judgments on the basis of expert advice. With the greatest respect to the Honourable Lady, I think we need to follow the expert advisors, not her own instincts. We're focusing on the buildings over 18 metres where the work needs to get done, and in those buildings, we're ensuring that the leaseholder never pays. We want the building owners to step up and meet the cost, but where that's not possible, and in many cases, I'm afraid it isn't because the building owners are no longer around. In those situations, the taxpayer will step in and meet the cost with the advantage of the levy and the tax to come to help recoup the costs. That must be the right approach. She asks whether enough progress has been made. Well, actually, we've ended 2020 with 95% of buildings over 18 metres with the most dangerous form of cladding, ACM cladding, either having been remediated or the workers are on site doing the job. And that's 100% of the buildings in the social sector. And that's a huge step forward. And I pay tribute to everyone who's been part of that over the course of the year, including keeping the works going during the pandemic, which many politicians, I have to say, including Labour politicians, asked us not to do. That was the wrong judgment, but we kept those works going. For lower rise buildings, those of 4 to 6 stories, then we're bringing into play this important new financing scheme. And that means that those leaseholders who have, at the moment, impossible costs, providing great worry and strain, will now be able to have the reassurance that those costs are turned into manageable ones, and they will never need to pay more than £50 a month, and many will pay far less, and only where the cladding really does need to come off to make sure that the building is safe. That will provide peace of mind to hundreds of thousands of leaseholders, and I think can be seen as a generous, affordable way forward for the taxpayer. You have to remember that when the Prime Minister and I came to office 18 months ago, there was only £200 million of government money available to support leaseholders in this situation. And that in itself was the result of incredibly hard work by my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Bexley and Sidcup. Today, 18 months later, there are many, many billions of pounds of support in direct government grant and then billions more, no doubt, in financing scheme funding available to support those leaseholders and to get the situation under control. Meanwhile, what is happening in other parts of the country? Well, we know that in Scotland, according to a recent FOI request, the Scottish Government have done absolutely nothing. The funding that they received from the Building Safety Fund is sat in a bank account in Edinburgh, and they've done nothing with it. I'd be interested to know from the Honourable Lady what the Welsh Government is doing. I don't know. Perhaps she can inform us. And the Honourable Lady herself came to this late. It was only a week or so ago that she convened the first debate on this in her tenure. She didn't offer a plan. She didn't show an appreciation of the scale and the complexity of the issue. She offered a task force, a committee. Empty words, I'm afraid, and gestures. That's not good enough. While she was doing that, the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend the Chancellor, and I were working with the lenders, the insurers, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and the leaseholder groups to bring forward what we've announced today, which I hope all fair-minded members across the House will see as a very significant intervention, which does get unsafe cladding off buildings and end the cladding scandal. It does provide reassurance and confidence to leaseholders. It does ensure that the developers and the industry pay their fair share. It does build a world-class building safety regime. And it does enable us now to move forwards, to reopen and restore confidence in the housing market so the country can move forward again.
Let's head to West Sussex with Sir Peter Bottomley. Sir Peter.
Speaker, can I first say I'm a leaseholder neither affected by the problem nor gaining by the solution. Can I say to my right honourable friend, we recognise this is another set of major steps along the way during the last 3 years. The problems were spelt out by the all-party group, and I pay tribute to the honourable member for Ellesmere Port and Neston for working together in a cross-party way. There will be more to do, and the Select Committee will no doubt have hearings. I want to ask my right honourable friend if you'll first of all thank the Chancellor and the Prime Minister for helping to make the funding available. I won't claim it's going to be enough, but it's a major step forward, and I recognise that. There's the problem about low-rise in low-income areas who may look at high-rise and high-income areas getting more direct help. Can you talk about that? And can he say that no leaseholder who doesn't actually own anything will have to sign away any of their rights to eventual compensation as and when the inquiry finishes and any civil claims of liability against developers, manufacturers, local building control or national regulators come to be finalised? Thank you.
Well, can I praise my honourable friend for his determined campaigning on this issue, which I think everybody in this House has recognised over many years and for which many leaseholders will no doubt be grateful. I've been pleased to work with him and to take his advice when it's been needed. I can assure him that the funding that we've made available today will provide leaseholders with the certainty and confidence that they need. That any leaseholder in a building over 80 metres will now know that they will not have to pay for the removal of cladding. And those leaseholders in the buildings that are lower rise those of 11 to 18 metres, can have great comfort from the fact that this new financing arrangement will be in place. It doesn't preclude any actions by the building or by the leaseholders against insurers or those holding warranties, the developers, and those actions should take place. We want to see those who made these mistakes brought to book. We don't want this all to fall upon the taxpayer. That's absolutely essential, because this is a very difficult judgment. We have to balance the interests of leaseholders who are homeowners with those of the broader taxpayer as well, and ensure that we're striking the right balance. I think we've done that today, and I hope this is a major step forward in the battle against this issue.
I now head to SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson, who's participating virtually with 3 minutes. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This announcement today of an additional £3.5 billion is encouraging as far as it goes, and I'm sure the Scottish Government looks forward to the consequentials arising from this announcement. And what the Secretary of State has said today will offer some relief to homeowners affected by cladding issues, many of whom are already struggling with bills and simply don't feel able to take on more debt, as their dream homes have become a nightmare with mortgage ratings of 0 due to unsafe cladding. The consequences, as he knows, have been far-reaching for those caught up in this scandal, with homes currently worth nothing, which cannot be sold and which residents feel unsafe. I very much welcome the responsibility for cladding being borne, in part at least, by the larger players in the industry, but more details as to how that works is needed. However, despite what the Secretary of State has said, that no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 per month in paying back loans to remove this cladding, I'm sure he will understand this will still be disappointing for many, since through no fault of their own, they are still facing additional costs after buying their homes in good faith and face debt which they don't want and which will impact on household incomes during these difficult times. Much more detail on exactly how these low interest loans will work is needed. But can the Secretary of State confirm that there will be an upper limit to these additional costs for leaseholders, or is the £50 cap only a monthly cap? He will appreciate that this matters because building work so often overruns. And what time frame within which does he expect this remediation work to be completed?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for welcoming much of the substance of the announcement today. I would draw her back to the remarks I made earlier, which is that, to the best of my knowledge, the Scottish Government have made no use at all of the funding they've been provided through the existing Building Safety Fund. And so I think important questions now need to be answered by her government in Scotland as to what is actually happening there. What are they doing to support leaseholders? How are they making those buildings safe? With respect to the financing scheme that we bring forwards in England, it will be a matter for the Scottish Government, or indeed the Welsh or Northern Irish administrations, to decide whether they wish to create a similar scheme. We have set this upper limit of £50 a month. So this does provide a great deal of comfort to leaseholders that they'll never need to pay more than that per month. And that's about the equivalent of the average service charge for a purpose-built block of flats. I appreciate that this is a cost that no one would wish to bear, but I think it is a reasonable one in balancing the interests of the taxpayer with providing support and protection to the leaseholder. We'll be bringing forward further details on how that scheme works as quickly as we can. I think it's important also to say that the arrangement that we'll be creating is not a loan to an individual. This is a financing scheme with buildings. The loans do not sit with the individual. They won't affect their credit rating. These are loans on a long tenure that will remain with the building and will ensure that the leaseholders themselves can move on with their lives.
We now come to Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I would like to thank the Secretary of State for working so closely with me on cladding issues over the course of the last 15 months. I have been calling for a substantial and comprehensive package for cladding remediation. So I warmly welcome this announcement, which very importantly allows funds to be deployed very quickly and does not require task forces or legislation. Now, I have called for a package of £5 to £10 billion, very quickly trying to tot up all of the numbers as you went through the details. I think this could be approaching certainly the middle, if not the upper end of that range. Can my right honourable friend confirm that and also assure me that money will be deployed as quickly as possible? Thank you.
Well, can I praise my honourable friend who has been a fantastic Member of Parliament for Kensington since she was elected and has raised this and other issues arising out of the Grenfell tragedy almost every week with me. In fact, we do meet every week to discuss these issues. She's right to say there's a very substantial intervention. We've already made £1.6 billion available, and we estimate that it will require another £3.5 billion to complete the remediation of unsafe cladding on buildings over 18 metres and to make good on the promise that we've made today to those leaseholders. In addition to that, we'll be bringing forward the financing scheme, and as I've said, the details of that will be published shortly, but it is a very generous scheme, and there is a significant cost to the taxpayer of ensuring the £50 cap gives that added level of protection and reassurance to leaseholders. So the total intervention that we're making today is, as she says, one of many, many billions of pounds. That's a difficult judgment, which the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have made with me, but we do believe this is a fair and generous settlement to help everybody move forwards.
We now head to the Chair of the Select Committee, Clive Betts in Sheffield. Clive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Select Committee, could I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and welcome it as far as it goes, because in terms of the Select Committee recommendations, it does, of course, only go so far. So I'd like to invite the Secretary of State to come back to the Select Committee to discuss these issues in more detail shortly after the recess. Immediately, will he confirm that as a result of the loan scheme, no leaseholder will be placed in negative equity? Secondly, in terms of the additional costs, non-cladding costs to deal with building safety, has he done any assessment of the impact of those costs, the total amount of those costs that will fall on leaseholders? And finally, will he confirm that there is no help in this statement for councils and housing associations, and as a result, to carry out essential safety work, they're going to have to put up rents, cut maintenance, or cut the number of affordable homes they can build?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman and the members of the Select Committee for their expert advice on this issue over a number of years, and to me personally as Secretary of State. Of course, I'd be delighted to come before his committee and discuss this further in the near future. When he says that this doesn't go as far as he would have liked, I appreciate that sentiment, and no doubt there will be leaseholders watching today who would wish us to go even further. But this is a very significant intervention. We do have to keep coming back to that. English property rights, very broadly speaking, are based on caveat emptor, buyer beware, and the contents of the leases, the contracts, the warranties, the insurance policies that we as homeowners sign. What we're doing today is stepping in a way that governments haven't done in the past, that they haven't done when people's homes have been flooded or subject to subsidence or other unforeseen and incredibly difficult and challenging issues. We've chosen to do this because we have immense sympathy for the leaseholders affected, and as a matter of basic public safety, we have to get this unsafe materials off buildings as quickly as possible. And so I think this is the right judgment and the right balance to be struck between the interests of the leaseholder and those of the broader taxpayer. But I'd be delighted to come before his committee and discuss this in more detail soon.
Let's head to Burton with Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the measures that my right honourable friend has set out today, but can I urge him to review the long-term issues here? Profitability should not come before safety. Will my right honourable friend look into the issues that I hear about regularly of new build properties not being built to high enough standards, leaving homeowners spending months chasing developers to come back and fix problems with their homes.
I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. We all believe in home ownership. We want to get more people onto the housing ladder, and we know that owning a home of your own is one of the most special achievements in life. But we also know that in recent years, some of our developers, and some of our most prominent ones too, have built homes which are to a poor standard. They have admitted it in some cases. And we need to make sure that that's corrected so that the quality of homes in this country is high and that members of the public can have confidence making that life-changing investment. It cannot be right that buying a home affords you less protection than buying a mobile phone or many other things we do in our daily lives. We want to see a major change in the culture of the industry so that homeowners get the product, the brilliant, beautiful, high-quality home that they deserve. We've set up a new Homes Ombudsman, and that's going to be passed into law as part of the Building Safety Regulator. And the new regulatory regime, which is already in existence in shadow form, will be put into permanent form through the passing of that bill. For higher-rise buildings, those over 18 metres, that will create a very strict, world-class regulatory regime.
Let's head to West Ham with Lynn Brown. Lynn Brown.
Agree with everything the Honourable Member for Bristol West said, with knobs on. My constituents won't be reassured by what they've heard. Loans for leaseholders still ain't off the table. He's avoided talking about non-cladding costs, and there's still no guarantee my constituents won't be left with large associated bills for problems they didn't create. And a number of institutions are frankly profiteering from this crisis, including parts of the insurance industry and others, eye-watering premiums. Why are we still waiting for this Secretary of State to get a grip on this crisis?
Well, I'm disappointed by the tone of the Honourable Lady's remarks. She has actually followed this issue very closely and has fought for her constituents, and I praise her, recognise her for that hard work. But this government has done a huge amount, and I entirely reject her accusations. We have brought forward the public inquiry. We've planned and are now legislating for a new building safety regulator, a world-class regulatory regime. We've brought in people to ensure that the unsafe cladding on ACM-clad high-rise buildings is remediated, and that work has progressed a great deal over the course of the year. As I said earlier, many Labour politicians, including the Mayor of London, opposed that initially at the height of the pandemic. So we've done a great deal, but there's more to be done. I don't know what her proposition is with respect to other materials beyond cladding. All the expert opinion says focus on cladding. That is the primary risk here. That is the focus that government should have. I will keep following expert advice. If the Labour Party's position is that we shouldn't follow that, and that in fact the Chancellor should write a blank cheque and say that absolutely any building safety defect on any building of any height should be paid for by the taxpayer, then that is a cost, a very, very substantial cost, and I'd be interested to know how she intends to fund that. With respect to the insurance companies, I do now expect them to step up and ensure that their premiums are proportionate and risk-based, because I think some of them have been exploiting leaseholders in a very difficult position.
Right, let's head to the West Midlands with Sean Bailey. Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by welcoming my right honourable friend's statement today? It was clearly the right one. But can I ask my right honourable friend, he touched on it in one of his responses earlier, clearly what leaseholders are ultimately going to care about is making sure this remediation is done. So can I ask him what work he is undertaking with SMEs, particularly, for example, like Baylis Roof and Cladding in Tipton, to ensure that they can actually get this work done and leaseholders can finally be freed of this dangerous cladding and the impact that it has on their status as homeowners?
Well, the approach that I took when I became Secretary of State was to set a target for us that we would either remediate all buildings or get the workers on site by the end of last year. And as I say, with a few exceptions, largely because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we achieved that. We've used project managers and consultants to ensure that every single building in that cohort is being individually managed. And myself and my ministers have been meeting with the contractors, the leaders of local councils, the chief executives, the residents' management associations of those buildings regularly to ensure the progress is happening. That work needs to continue and needs to broaden out now to all those buildings that will benefit from today's announcement. He's also right to say that today's announcement will create certainty and confidence for the broader construction sector to come forward and enter the market to do this work. That will create thousands of jobs, and I would encourage businesses, large and small, to take part in this major initiative.
Head up to Bedfordshire with Rachel Hopkins. Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased the Secretary of State wants to tackle rising insurance premiums, but I've also spoken to many leaseholders in my constituency of Luton South who have faced additional costs around other interim safety measures such as Waking Watch, and also in fixing other fire safety issues, which the Secretary of State seemed to push back on. These joined up financial pressures are pushing many leaseholders near to bankruptcy. So what is the government doing to help bring down these costs?
Well, we are working with the insurance sector, and I think they do now need to take a more proportionate risk-based approach. Some of the examples, they might be outliers, but the examples I've heard of insurance premiums rising by 1,000% are completely out of kilter with the statistics that I gave earlier, that only 10 people last year tragically died in buildings over 11 metres, and only 41 people died in any house fire in this country at all. With respect to Waking Watch, I think that is a very challenging issue, but we have brought forward our £30 million fund to replace Waking Watches with high-quality, effective fire alarm systems. That fund is now open, and I'd encourage any building, perhaps including the one in the Honourable Lady's constituency, to apply for it, get the fire alarm installed, and then hopefully reduce those costs quickly.
Drop in on Sir David Avenant. Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and know there will be many people in my constituency and across the country who will be relieved that the government is taking further action on this issue of unsafe cladding. Does he agree with me that speed is of the essence, and could he confirm that the additional financial remediation will help relieve the worry and will remove unfair and unfounded costs on leaseholders to deal with the removal of unsafe cladding?
I certainly can, and I thank the Honourable Gentleman, my right honourable friend, for the work that he's done on behalf of his constituents. I know we've corresponded on this subject many times. Today's announcement will provide comfort and reassurance to hundreds of thousands of leaseholders, and I'd also draw his attention and that of the House to the work that we're doing with RICS, which will ensure that around 50% of those individuals who might have required an EWS1 form now to no longer need to go through that laborious and often expensive process.
We now head to St Albans with Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When there was a failure of regulation in the city, the government bailed out the banks in a matter of days to the tune of £500 billion. In the face of a failure of fire safety regulation, when people are terrified of burning to death in their homes, the government has taken 3.5 years and only offered 6. Some of my constituents are still facing the cost of non-cladding fire safety problems, waking watches and more. So when will the government accept the basic principle that cladding victims should not have to pay a penny to fix fire safety problems that are not of their making?
Well, actually, the government acted decisively in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell Tower. Expert opinion has evolved over time. The first expert advice the government received was, as I said earlier, to focus on ACM cladding, the cladding that's on the Grenfell Tower, and to focus on those buildings over 18 metres. We put in place the funding to do that, where the building owners and the industry weren't able or wouldn't pay themselves. The expert advice then said that there were some other materials which were somewhat less unsafe, but nonetheless still could be unsafe. And that work is underway, and the Chancellor gave an extra £1 billion at the budget a year ago to do that. And then we brought forward this very, very substantial intervention today. So we're working intensively and extensively to tackle the issue, and I hope today's intervention will be a permanent and lasting settlement.
Let's head to the North West with Andy Carter. Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I also thank the Secretary of State for his statement today in relation to building safety. Warrington doesn't have any apartments above 18 metres, which would require remediation. But I have heard from a number of parents concerned that their sons and daughters are paying additional charges levied by landlords to cover the cost of insurance and waking watches in apartments that they've purchased. wonder if my right honourable friend can set out what steps the government are taking to cover these costs so that the burden doesn't fall on families of my constituents.
Well, the announcement that we've made today and the work that my right honourable friend and I, the Chancellor and I, have done with each of the major retail banks who strongly support this intervention does give much greater confidence to lenders, to surveyors and to insurers to re-enter the market, to bring down those premiums, to lend against these buildings and enable the market to move forwards again. This will take time. There is more to be done. But I think you will see the market now moving forward in a way that it hasn't done in recent months.
Let's head north to Dame Diana Johnson. Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has referred to fairness and the need for building companies to step up. And I understand that he is introducing a levy on those companies. But what more is he doing to pursue those responsible for building unsafe homes, leaving the taxpayers and leaseholders to meet the clean-up costs?
Well, the Honourable Lady raised an extremely important point, and let me be absolutely clear. The first thing that the government has done is establish the independent Grenfell inquiry. That has already heard some absolutely shocking allegations of malpractice and, in fact, outright dishonesty amongst some of the construction products manufacturers. It will be a matter for the police whether they choose to take forward criminal prosecutions against individuals or companies involved. In terms of remediation, we want the building owners to pay. Some have, and I'm grateful for that. In fact, some of the large volume house builders, even today, have come forward saying that they will pay more. That needs to continue, and nothing that I've said today should take away from that. They should still come forward, as well as paying their fair share through the levy and the tax that I've announced today.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Mark Menzies. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for making this significant intervention? But will he assure me that the industry responsible, which includes some of the wealthiest individuals and organisations in the land, will be paying its fair share when taxpayers, many of whom are not homeowners, are already being hit hard enough?
The levy and the tax that I have announced today and that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and I will be setting out more details on, ensure that the industry pays its fair share, in addition to them stepping up and paying for the remediation of buildings for which they've got responsibility. It has to be said that there's no simple solution to this. Many of the builders and developers who constructed these buildings are long gone. They've gone into administration. They're shell companies offshore. This is not a simple challenge to fix, as some have suggested. But I hope the measures we've taken today will go a long way.
Let's head to Dame Margaret Hodge. Dame Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of members have said that getting any money out of government has proved painfully slow. So leaseholders today are facing extra costs for insurance whilst their buildings remain unsafe. Building insurance at the ropeworks in Barking rocketed from 70,000 to 650,000. That's a 900% hike in just 2 years. Now, the ABI has told me that ministers have refused to engage to find an urgent, practical way forward now. Will the minister assure us today that the government will immediately engage with all insurers, take on some of that short-term risk so that leaseholders can buy affordable cover until their buildings are made safe?
Well, can I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the work that she's done, and she and I have worked together since the terrible fire that her constituents suffered in Barking. She's right to raise the issue of insurance, as other members of the House have done already. There is a challenge here because, as with the lenders, the insurers are faced with assessing a new and heightened level of risk. But I do think that the Association of British Insurers now needs to step up and take a proportionate risk-based approach. As I've said repeatedly, the risk to life in buildings is actually very low, mercifully, with the tragic exception of the events of 2017. And so insurers should be pricing that risk correctly and not passing on those costs or even profiteering on the backs of the leaseholders. We have engaged repeatedly with the insurers, both myself and my honourable friend, the noble Lord Greenhouse, who leads on building safety, and we will do so again.
We now go to Andrew Selous.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy. Significant intervention and the relief that it will bring to so many people. And does the Secretary of State agree with me that we've established a very important principle today, that if developers ever behave in this type of manner again, the government will come after them and not the hard-pressed taxpayer to put these issues right?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We all feel immense sympathy for the leaseholder. They are innocent parties in this situation. But it also isn't right that the taxpayer, the broader taxpayer, many of whom are not homeowners at all, has to step in and foot the bill. So we've tried to strike a balance today, and we've tried to ensure that the developers, the builders, the industry behind this pays a fair share. In the building safety bill that we'll be bringing forward later this year, we'll bring forward a very tight regulatory regime so that buildings, those over 18 metres, the high-rise buildings, are built to a very high standard, and these issues should not happen again.
Deputy Speaker, leaseholders in Hornsey and Wood Green have been trapped for the third lockdown in a terrible situation with building defects, unsure when they can lend, when they can get a mortgage to move on in their property. One said, "I'm at my wit's end with a small newborn baby." So I hope that today will bring her some succour. But what about councils and what about housing associations, which after 10 years of austerity simply do not have the money to be able to give much relief to desperate leaseholders? Has he got any good news for those leaseholders?
Yes, well, the Honourable Lady raises an important point. We have been working very closely with local authorities since the start of this issue in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell tragedy, and I've engaged repeatedly with the National Housing Federation, who've done excellent work in this regard. We did provide funding to help support them, and we're focusing the funding that we've provided on those housing associations or local councils who cannot fund this themselves, either through their own reserves or their ability to borrow. Most housing associations can do that. There will be a small number who can't. Of course, there are choices at every turn in this, and that in itself will have consequences and make it harder for those housing associations to invest in more affordable and social housing or other important aims that they and I share, like making those buildings more energy efficient to meet our climate obligations as well. That's the difficult situation that we find ourselves in. The other thing I would just say to the Honourable Lady is I'm acutely aware of the challenges faced by shared owners, and we're going to make particular provision to protect them so that they don't have to meet disproportionate costs with respect to cladding remediation.
18 withdrawn, so we go to Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my constituency, I have a number of buildings that are below 18 metres. Today's announcement means leaseholders of these buildings will still need to foot the bill, and the offer of loans is small comfort to my constituents, many of whom are already struggling. So what does the Secretary of State say to my constituents who were promised leaseholders wouldn't have to pay for a crisis they didn't cause?
Well, let me be clear on this point once again. The expert advice is very clear. That says that we should focus our attention on the buildings where there is a higher risk. Those are buildings over 18 metres, and so it's right that government chooses to do that when it's using such large sums of taxpayer money. For those buildings between 11 and 18 metres, between approximately 4 and 6 stories, then we are bringing forward this financing scheme, which will enable leaseholders to move forward with confidence and certainty in the knowledge that they'll never need to pay more than £50 a month to meet the cladding remediation, where that absolutely needs to be done. And I do go back to the point I've tried to make repeatedly, that in many, many cases it will not need to be done because we want surveyors and the industry to take a proportionate risk-based approach which takes true account of the risk to life in those properties, which for most leaseholders, mercifully, is very low.
We now go to Caroline Ansell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too many people in Eastbourne have suffered the stress and the strain of looming costs, and today there will be some relief at the announcement that my right honourable friend has made. It is a significant intervention, and I look forward to seeing the details on that. It also recognises fairness, and it recognises balance, and I welcome that also. Can I ask, although we are of course today focusing on cladding, can I ask what further work there will be done to help those leaseholders who are now facing costs around fire safety defects also exposed in the wake of the Grenfell tragedy, not cladding, but fire breaks, fire doors, and those very necessary works, which themselves can be very costly too.
Well, the Honourable Lady has championed her constituents in this regard, and she and I have discussed this in the past. I hope the announcement will provide comfort to some of the constituents that I'm aware of in Eastbourne. One building in particular that I think we've corresponded on is above 18 metres, and so will certainly be a beneficiary of this scheme if it hasn't been of previous ones. She's right to raise the fact that there are other building safety defects which have come to light, and we have spoken about those in the past, whether that's fire blocks, insulation or fire doors, and some of those works will need to be done. That needs to be done on a proportionate risk-based approach, only where there is a true risk to life, so that the bill for leaseholders is not disproportionate. We also, of course, want to see the building owners step up and pay for those works. Where there's been poor workmanship, the building owner needs to take responsibility, and we will continue to do everything we can to support leaseholders to pursue those claims.
We now go to Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the intervention this afternoon and the Secretary of State's acknowledgement of the despair and sheer anger that people and families experience since they've been living in unsafe homes due to unsafe cladding. However, I put it to the Secretary of State that what my constituents will want to hear is clear timescales for this remedial work, as it has now been nearly 4 years since so many lives were lost in the Grenfell fire. Leaseholders need reassurance that they will not need to wait another 4 years. Please also explain why leaseholders should be made to pay hidden costs or otherwise for a problem they did not cause. Is this the best the government can do, and is this what the government considers to be fair?
Well, I do think this is a fair intervention. It's the largest of its type I think any government in this country has ever made. It is a balance between the interests of the leaseholders and those of the broader taxpayer, as I've already said. In terms of wider building safety defects, as I said in answer to the Honourable Lady for Eastbourne, we'll do everything we can to support leaseholders to pursue action against those people who made those errors and omissions in the past. And I share the anger of leaseholders of the mistakes that have been made, both those by industry and by regulators who came before us. What we must do now as a government is move forward, make sure this never happens again, and support leaseholders as much as we practically can do. And that's exactly what we intend to do.
Sir Edward Lee.
May I once again say a word on behalf of a group of people who hardly ever gets a mention in this chamber, namely the poor, benighted general taxpayer. Barely a single one of my 75,000 constituents lives in a house or block of flats over 4 stories high. Yet living in poor rural areas, once again, they are being asked to bail out, in this case, greedy developers in rich, wealthy areas. So can we have a balance? And before I finish, can I just ask him about Lincoln University, which has been forced to reclad one of its residences, and what discussions he's had with the universities and his education colleague on this issue?
Well, on the important second point that he raises, we have worked with both the Department for Education and the Department for Health on buildings within the wider public sector, universities, student halls of residences, and in a small number of cases, buildings within the NHS to ensure that the works proceed at pace there. And I'll happily update him with respect to Lincoln University. The first point he makes is actually an extremely important one. We've had to strike a careful balance here, because there are millions of our fellow citizens in this country who are not homeowners, and we have to protect their interests just as we want to provide safety and fairness for the leaseholder. That's the balance we've tried to strike today, and I hope that fair-minded people across the House and in the country will appreciate that and understand the choices we've made.
We now go to Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome today's announcement, and this is a testament to the campaigning of leaseholders across the country. I'm sure the Secretary of State believes that the deal he's negotiated with the Treasury is a great success, but for many of my constituents in Vauxhall, this will not make any or little material difference. A number of leaseholders continue to pay thousands of pounds for interim safety measures. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue at hand today is one of principle and fairness. And the upshot for many constituents is that they are still paying despite the government's assurances. So if the government subscribes to the principle that no leaseholder should have to pay for the fire safety problems, can the Secretary of State please explain why this package clearly shows that not all leaseholders are treated equally?
Well, the Honourable Lady is wrong. There will be thousands of her constituents who will directly benefit from today's announcement. We've chosen rightly, on the basis of expert advice, to prioritise buildings over 18 metres. That is where the greatest risk is. It would be quite wrong for us to direct public money, taxpayers' money, to buildings where the risk is low or extremely remote. So we're targeting it on the buildings that need it the most. And in those buildings, leaseholders can have certainty that they will not be paying for the remediation of unsafe cladding. It will either be paid by the building owner, the developer, which is quite right, or it will be paid for by the taxpayer, and we'll be using the levy and the new tax to recoup as much of that as we possibly can. And in the other buildings, those where the risk is significantly lower, we will be ensuring the new financing arrangement gives real comfort to people that they'll never need to pay more than £50 a month. And my expectation is that many, many of them will pay significantly less than that. So I think to most reasonable people, that will be a sum of money which is truly affordable and manageable within the budget of most homeowners.
We now go to Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for all his hard work on this, and I welcome what he has announced today. But could I ask my right honourable friend what the Scottish and Welsh governments are doing to improve building safety?
I honestly don't know. The Scottish government have, as far as I'm aware, done nothing with the very significant sum of money that the Chancellor gave them previously through the Barnett Consequentials process. I'm not aware of what the Welsh Government is doing. I think those are questions that are better directed to the Scottish Government and to the Welsh Labour administration.
We now go to Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said that his mission is the safety and fairness of leaseholders. How then do today's proposals protect a leaseholder who's been paying £50 a month, but at the point of sale still has a large loan outstanding on their home due to the cost of removing unsafe cladding? Isn't the truth that he's failed to deliver on promise of fairness and he's choosing to leave thousands of leaseholders facing massive costs?
The honourable gentleman, for whom I've got great respect, but he misunderstands the scheme that we've just announced. For those buildings between 4 and 6 storeys, where the risk is much lower, leaseholders will have the opportunity, if they wish to, with no compulsion, the opportunity to take advantage of the financing scheme. That loan scheme financing arrangement will sit with the building. It will not sit with the individual. It won't affect their own personal credit rating, and it shouldn't have a material impact upon the value of their property. It will be akin to paying somewhat more on your service charge every month. And as I say, it will be capped at £50 a month, which is akin to the average service charge. And of course, many buildings pay service charges far in excess of that already.
Now go to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In drawing the House's attention to my register of interest, can I say to my right honourable friend, I think this is one of the most generous and innovative schemes anywhere. Can I ask him particularly about those buildings to where the finance loan scheme is applicable, and whether it will be applicable to non-cladding costs, but nevertheless have a material health and safety element in them, for example, fire doors and asbestos?
Well, we've chosen to focus both the grant scheme and the financing arrangements on cladding. That's, I think, for good reason, because the expert advice that we've received from the independent panel consistently says that cladding is the greatest danger that needs to be combated. There may be other defects in buildings. They will vary widely, building to building, and those will have to be a matter for the building owner and for the homeowners. But we, as a government, are going to tackle the big issue here, which is cladding, and end the cladding scandal that began with the Grenfell Tower tragedy.
Now go to Justin Madders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the funding announced as a step in the right direction, but unfortunately, it's only likely to cover around half the anticipated costs, and it is the innocent leaseholder who will be picking up the bill for the other half. The Secretary of State has said he has sympathy for leaseholders, but that sympathy doesn't appear to extend below 18 metres and directly contradicts the promise repeatedly made that no leaseholder would have to pay anything. I deeply regret the government's decision to break that promise and create another injustice. So can the Secretary of State say how many leaseholders he now estimates will be subject to the loan scheme that he has announced today?
State. We don't want any leaseholder to be paying for fire safety defects. We want that to be paid for by the building owners, the developers, the builders, the people who did this in the first place. Where that's not possible, and as I said before, there are circumstances where that's the case because there are building owners that no longer exist, that's gone bankrupt, there are shell companies overseas. That's the world that we're dealing with. This is complex and multifaceted. It is not simple. In those situations, buildings above 18 metres where the greatest risk lies will take advantage of the new scheme, and no leaseholder in that situation will have to pay for the remediation of unsafe cladding. Below 18 metres where the risk is significantly lower, guided by our expert opinion, the financing arrangements will be in place. This is a comprehensive plan to provide comfort and reassurance, certainty and confidence to as many leaseholders as possible.
28 is withdrawn, so we go to Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday it was revealed that the company who made the Grenfell Tower cladding shamefully, knowingly sold flammable materials to construction projects because it was around £4 cheaper than fire retardant cladding. It's taken the government all of these years to propose measures that will stop companies prioritising savings over life, in that they still haven't bothered to identify all of the buildings, including care homes and hospitals, that may have unsafe cladding. Why is that?
Well, the Honourable Lady is wrong. As a matter of fact, we moved swiftly. We set up the Grenfell inquiry, which has heard those shocking allegations. We've brought forward the Judith Hackett review of building safety, which concluded that the regulatory regime needed to change. We've drafted and are now bringing forward the legislation to do that. And I hope, incidentally, that she and members opposite will vote for the fire safety bill and the building safety bill when they come before this House soon, because that is the best way of creating the new regime, holding developers to account and making sure that local fire and rescue services and councils have the powers they need to take action against unsafe buildings. I too have been shocked by the allegations that I've heard at the inquiry, and that is why, as an interim step, before we hear the judge's recommendations, I've announced that we're going to create a new national regulator of construction products, and that I'm going to review the testing procedures for construction products which seem to be woefully inadequate.
Final question is to Bob Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I would like to thank my right honourable friend for listening to the representations that we made from the Select Committee and from other colleagues. People who live in high-rise buildings will be breathing a sigh of relief, I think, from his announcements today, and I would like to thank him for those. The people that live in medium-rise blocks, I think we need to reserve judgment to make sure we examine the details of his announcements today. Can I ask him specifically that the applications for the fund that he's previously been running, there are some 1,100 incomplete applications, many of which require survey work to be undertaken. And there is an issue about whether there's capacity to do that from the industry, and indeed whether that work will actually demonstrate what is needed. But more importantly than that, the cost of those surveys has to be borne by someone. So what is he doing about ensuring those surveys are carried out and indeed the applications then made complete to the fund so that work can continue on the buildings that are currently unsafe?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman, my Honourable Friend, for his support and advice in recent months and that of all members of the Select Committee. With respect to the fund, we've received a large number of applications which, as he says, are incomplete. That reflects the fact that many building owners do not know as much as they should know about the materials on their buildings, and so a great deal of work needs to be done to assess those so they can now be funded, the work's contracted, and we get those workers on site to do the important building safety works as quickly as possible. There's a particular problem which he alights on with respect to the number of fully trained, competent assessors who can go out and do that important first step. We're working with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors to dramatically increase the number of fully trained assessors. That work has started and the numbers are already increasing. And we're also working with the Treasury so that those individuals are not merely trained, but can get the professional indemnity insurance that they'll need to do the job. If we can bring those two things together, and that's happening quickly, then we'll be able to have a very significant increase in the number of individuals going out, doing the assessments, helping to give certainty to individuals and getting the works started.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and suspend the House for 3 minutes to make the necessary arrangements for the next business. Okay. Order. Order. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Chris Skidmore, who's participating virtually.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to prohibit the operation and advertising of SA Mill services and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, companies that encourage students, researchers, and even school pupils to part with money in return for work can be passed off as their own should have no place in a modern society that recognises the power of knowledge to improve individual lives, to train young people for their role in society, and to achieve their future potential. And yet in the UK, these services and their operations currently remain entirely legal. It is this unacceptable feature of the British education system that my bill today seeks to change. These so-called SA mills are a rot that infects the very discipline of learning, a rot that has the potential to damage academic integrity beyond repair, and it is sad to say it is a rot that is spreading, not only amongst higher education, but across all forms and levels of education, from schools to further education colleges. The online presence of SA mills and their websites that encourage contract cheating is all pervasive. 3 years ago, it was estimated that 115,000 students at UK universities were buying essays. Then 46 vice-chancellors wrote a joint letter calling for these websites to be banned. This call is now supported by Universities UK, the Russell Group, Guild HE, the QAA, indeed most, if not all, higher education institutions and organisations that I had the privilege of working with, both as a universities minister, but now also as co-chair of the all-party group on universities. But for me, the most passionate advocates of ending SA mills have been the students themselves and student unions who've campaigned determinedly against their operation. For each week that passes during the COVID pandemic, the situation is only growing worse. As students that have been forced to study remotely from home, away from campus, on welfare and support, taking their studies and exams online, they're becoming increasingly a prey to SA mills, whose number has increased dramatically. The QAA have revealed today that there are at least 932 sites in operation in the UK, up from 904 in December 2020, 881 in October 2020, and 635 back in June 2018. Their increased presence is even boasted of on a website, www.uktoppwriters.com, which provides a compare the markets service. And it's not just the number, but the nature of the threat that's expanding. Recent research published this month by Professor Thomas Lancaster and Kodrin Kotalaran in the International Journal for International Educational Integrity points to extremely concerning phenomenon of students using file share websites, such as Check, to request exam answers in real time and receive answers live during the course of an examination. Indeed, the number of STEM student requests for this practice has risen by 196% over the past year. And in this year of all years, be in no doubt that SA mills are seeking to ruthlessly take advantage of the pandemic. One site's even offering cut price deals for essays, declaring to help you fight these tough conditions caused by the coronavirus outbreak, we've reduced the price of all our services by 50%. Grab the offer now. And that website proudly boasts of offering services in 21 university towns or cities in the UK. And this is the point, Madam Deputy Speaker, for SA mills and their use is not an exception to the rule. SA mills are becoming normalised. This point was underlined to me in several Zoom conversations I've had in preparation for the bill when I put my own call for evidence out to Research Fortnight. I'd like to put on record my thanks to individuals who attended these seminars on behalf of the National Union of Students, Anglia Ruskin, Loughborough, UCLan and Worcester Students' Unions, academics from the Universities of Coventry, Leeds, Northampton, Swansea, Kent and Loughborough, and organisations such as JISC, the QAA, Prospects, Turnitin, the Scottish Funding Council and the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales. I heard of stories of students now being recruited on campus as influencers, being paid to leaflet student halls with flyers offering SA mill services, tales of students being blackmailed by these companies for having paid for the essays with threats of being reported to their universities or employers, stories of international students of being targeted on Facebook, Twitter and WhatsApp, being encouraged to sign up to academic support services before they started university without even realising what they were doing was wrong. Time and time again, in this dark underworld of SA mills and the companies that seek to make a profit out of the insecurity and desperation of students, the common theme that emerged was of exploitation. Exploitation of students, particularly vulnerable students under pressure to do well in their studies, and students who are first in the family to attend university, on whom the pressure to succeed is immense. International students away from home for the first time. Not to mention exploitation of graduates abroad, some of the poorest countries in the world who are being forced to work 12-hour shifts writing essays for $1 an hour. Exploitation of graduates and students at home, so desperate for extra money that they're selling their essays for £10, which in turn will be sold on for £300. I wish to make clear that my bill would not seek to criminalise students themselves for using essay mills. Instead, I propose that universities need to look at new strategies for creating second chances, for educating students in their mistakes, following the example of the Courageous Conversation programme at the University of New South Wales that gives students the opportunity to own their mistakes before formal investigations begin. I believe that while we need to be tough on contract cheating, we must also be tough on the causes of contract cheating, which would not exist if there were not a market for them to exploit. Legislation to ban essay mills and their advertisement is long overdue. Already Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and most recently Ireland have taken action to make essay mills illegal in their countries. And the QAA has been in close contact with those countries who banned essay mills, monitoring its effect. Already, the ban is making a difference. In Australia, following legislation, EduBirdie, Essay Shark, Custom Writings websites, for instance, now all state that our service is not available in your region. Yet in contrast, they all still thrive in the UK. I know that Lord Storey has already introduced a bill in the other place, calling for similar measures to what I'm proposing. And I recognise the Department for Education may have specific issues with the legal text of that bill. What I hope to achieve today is to demonstrate that there is the support of both houses for legislation against essay mills. Indeed, my bill today is supported by members from all of the major political parties. It is also supported today by the chair of the Education Select Committee, the member for Harlow, the chair of the All-Party Group for Students, the member for Sheffield Central, and two former Secretaries of State, including the former Education Secretary, the member for East Hampshire. To the Minister listening, I would welcome a meeting to discuss how to take forward these proposals and indeed legislation forward, together with the members, the students and the academic experts I've assembled for this task, including Professor Michael Draper, who's helped to draft similar legislation for other countries that's now in operation. I have been grateful for the dedicated work of the professionals that I have worked with. Indeed, I'm grateful for the work of all those who are involved in stamping out contract cheating at universities and other education institutions. And I know, Minister, that they stand ready to help the Department for Education to take forward legislation that is sorely needed. Thank you very much.
The question is that the Right Honourable Member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Madam Deputy Speaker, Aaron Bell, Ben Lake, Carol Moynihan, Ellen Smith, Paul Blomfield, Damien Hines, Lloyd Russell Moyle, Layla Moran, Jason McCartney, Robert Halfon, Greg Clark, and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Skidmore.
Essay Mills Prohibition Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. Order. We now come to the motion on the Police Grant Report, England and Wales. Minister Kit Malthouse to move.
Madam Deputy Speaker, a great pleasure to follow our own version of Dorian Gray there, and indeed to announce to the House the final police funding settlement for 2021-22. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst I appreciate it's not ideal that the House is debating this publication prior to consideration by the Select Committee on Statutory Instruments, it is essential that suitable preparatory time is given to the relevant parties prior to implementation, and this, coupled with the difficulty in securing suitable floor of the House approval slots and the February recess, has meant that unfortunately it has not proved possible to achieve pre-scrutiny on this occasion, and I'm sorry about that. Nevertheless, Madam Deputy Speaker, public safety is an absolute priority for this government, which is why we're backing the police with the resources and powers they need to protect our communities. The professionalism, bravery and commitment shown by officers during the coronavirus pandemic has been truly extraordinary. Across the country, police forces continue to work tirelessly, building understanding with the public to help control the virus while also tackling crime. Despite all of the challenges we've faced in the last year, the police have been there to answer the call, and I would like to express my immense gratitude for their contribution to this unprecedented national effort. I also wish to place on record that my thoughts and condolences are with those who've lost loved ones and to our brave police officers and staff who've lost their lives to COVID-19.
His remarks and the work he does with the police. Is he as concerned as I am that during the pandemic, across the country, but in particular in Northamptonshire, the number of police officers coughed on, spat at or bitten rose to 130 attacks between February and November last year, up from 110 attacks during the same period the year before? Isn't this especially disgraceful given that the pandemic has been raging through our country?
Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is quite right. It is a complete disgrace. And unfortunately, we have seen during the pandemic the rise of this particularly unpleasant practice of spitting or coughing on police officers and claiming then to have COVID. And that comes off the back, sadly, of a general rise in assaults upon police and indeed emergency workers. I have to confess, I do not know what goes through the twisted mind of somebody who would do such an unspeakable thing. But I hope that he will join me in voting with enthusiasm when the Police Powers and Protection Bill comes forward, both for the Police Covenant, which is there to protect police officers and to make sure that we pay attention to their well-being and protection, but also for the doubling of the sentencing for assault on emergency workers, which he and I both stood on as a promise in our manifesto in 2019. We do need penalties for these kind of awful offences to be increased, both to deter those who would think about these unspeakable things, but also to punish those who cross that appalling line. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do know that our police forces also have the thanks and respect of this House, and that this settlement demonstrates our ongoing commitment to tackling crime and delivering the safer communities that the law-abiding majority in this country rightly want to see. Last year, Parliament approved a funding settlement which resulted in an additional £1.1 billion being made available to the policing system. This made it the biggest increase in funding for the policing system since 2010. Included within this was an increase to government grant funding of £700 million for the first 6,000 additional police officers as part of the Uplift programme, a £90 million increase in funding for counter-terrorism policing, £247 million for local forces from the Counterattack Precept, and an extra £126 million provided for national policing programmes and priorities. Last year's settlement underlined the government's determination to strengthen our police service and tackle crime across the whole country. Next year's settlement will also enable the police to continue on this trajectory. For 2021-22, the government will be investing up to £15.8 thousand million into the policing system, up to an additional £636 million when compared to last year. Of this additional investment, the government will make an additional £415 million available for police and crime commissions in England and Wales to support the next wave of officer recruitment. This funding will enable PCCs to meet the necessary investment and ongoing support costs associated with the recruitment of 6,000 new officers by the end of the financial year 2021-22. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am delighted to say that forces are delivering on recruitment. As of 31st of December, an extraordinary 6,620 additional officers have been recruited as part of the Uplift programme, surpassing the programme's first-year recruitment 3 months ahead of schedule. This is superb progress and is a testament to the hard work of forces and indeed the brave men and women who've signed up to join the police and keep our communities safe. We want to thank all of them for their continued efforts, particularly those involved in the recruitment process. To ensure the secure management and success of the Uplift programme in the coming year, the government will once again create a ring-fence grant. Forces will be allocated a share of this £100 million in line with their funding formula allocation and will be able to access this funding as they make further progress on their recruitment targets. As has been the case this year, this is intended to ensure that forces deliver a return for this substantial uplift in funding. In 21-22, we will take recruitment one step further. we're expanding the scope of the programme to include regional organised crime units, including the equivalent units in the Metropolitan and City of London Police and counter-terrorism policing. By strengthening officer numbers across capabilities, we're sending a clear message to both policing and the public that we're absolutely committed to cutting crime in all its guises. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, police and crime commissioners have continued to request further flexibility around levels of police precept to make additional funding available for their local priorities. This settlement empowers them, particularly in England, to raise council tax contributions for local policing by less than 30p a week for a typical Band D household, or up to £15 a year. Local precept decisions should be carefully considered, with the impact that this will have on household budgets being an important factor. Many families face difficult circumstances as a result of the pandemic. If all police and crime commissioners decide to maximise their flexibility, the result will be a further £288 million of additional funding for local policing. I must reiterate, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the level of police precept is a local decision, and elected PCCs will, I know, carefully consider what they are asking their local constituents to pay. Locally elected commissioners will need to decide how to appropriately use this flexibility based on local policing needs, and will be held accountable for delivery on return on that public investment, not least in May this year. PCCs will also benefit from the additional funding announced by my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, whose statement will follow this, as part of the local government finance settlement for local council tax support. This funding will enable councils to continue reducing council tax bills for those least able to pay. Additionally, the government will compensate local authorities for 75% of the irrecoverable losses in council tax income arising in 2021, and collection fund deficits accrued for 2021 will be repayable over the next 3 years as opposed to 1 year. Beyond increases to core grant and precept, I am also pleased to announce £1.1 billion of funding to support national policing priorities. This includes £180 million for combating serious and organised crime, including drug trafficking and child sexual exploitation and abuse, and protecting National Crime Agency funding. We're providing £39 million for national support of the Police Uplift Programme to continue its success as well. We're also investing £500 million in Home Office-led police technology programmes, which will replace outdated legacy IT systems and provide the police with the modern digital infrastructure and tools they need to protect the public. In addition, we're investing £38.7 million to support forces with several national programmes and digital policing priorities such as public contact, data analytics and agile working for police forces. For next year, we're allocating £20 million to the Safer Streets Fund to build on the excellent work that's taking place this year to prevent acquisitive crimes such as theft and burglary in the worst affected areas. And I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that your Police and Crime Commission will apply to that fund. This funding will enable them and local authorities to invest in well-evidenced crime prevention measures such as CCTV and street lighting in new areas across the country. As I have said, public safety is a key priority. Funding for counter-terrorism policing will be maintained at over £900 million for the coming year. In addition, £32 million will be made available for the development of a new CT Operations Centre, which will bring together partners from counter-terrorism policing, the intelligence agencies and the criminal justice system, coordinating their expertise, resource and intelligence in a state-of-the-art facility. This investment is critical to help to continue the vital work of counter-terrorism police officers across the whole country. This settlement confirms significant investment in our police forces, and it's only right that we expect to see continued improvements in efficiency and productivity to demonstrate to the public that they are getting the most out of this increased funding. The Government therefore expects to see £120 million of efficiency savings delivered next year from across the law enforcement sector. These are reflected in the funding set out as part of the wider settlement. We expect these to be delivered through improved procurement practices, including the delivery of £20 million of savings through the new Blue Light Commercial Organisation, as well as savings in other areas such as estates, as I say, agile working and shared services. To ensure progress in these areas, the policing sector has worked closely with the Home Office to set up and support a new efficiency and productivity board. This board will improve the evidence base to date, identify opportunities for gains for this and future spending review periods, and monitor and support delivery gains. This settlement is the last before the next spending review. We will continue to monitor the demands facing policing and the impact that additional officer recruitment has on improving services to the public in responding to the threats from terrorism, organised crime and serious violence. The Government recognises that things have changed significantly since the last police funding settlement 1 year ago. We understand that our police forces are playing a critical role in our response to the pandemic, and I would once again like to express my immense gratitude, and I'm sure yours, Madam Deputy Speaker, for their heroic efforts. When it comes to law and order, we will always back the police to go after criminals and protect our communities and neighbourhoods. That is what the public rightly expect, and that is what we are delivering this year and next.
The question is, as on the order paper, Shadow Secretary of State Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to begin by putting on record our continuing gratitude for the selfless service, bravery and professionalism shown by our police officers and police staff. This pandemic has been a powerful reminder, not, frankly, that one should have been needed, of the risks they take daily on our behalf. Frankly, though, I say to the Minister that warm words are not enough. It's scant recognition for these officers and staff that they are rewarded for their efforts through the pandemic with a pay freeze. And furthermore, I would call on the Minister to work quickly with the Health Secretary to bring forward concrete recommendations for how they plan to make good on lukewarm commitments to prioritise frontline officers in the vaccine rollout. We know that officers are not able to control who they come into contact with. They're unable to socially distance as they go about their duties. So it is vital that as soon as possible they are able to be vaccinated. Officers have made the ultimate sacrifice and died from COVID whilst on service. So it's vital that we extend that protection as soon as possible. Even before the pandemic, we know that the risks and the pressures that have been heaped on police officers have increased significantly over the past decade. Attacks on police officers have jumped by 50% over the past 5 years. And this is sadly unsurprising when we have seen such steep increases in violence and violent crime on the streets and in homes across the country. Yet officers have been placed in an impossible position. This government oversaw huge cuts to police officer and staff numbers between 2010 and 2019. Police officer numbers fell by 21,000. And at the same time, there have been huge cuts to the services that are vital to preventing crime in the first place. Youth clubs, mental health services, local councils, probation. The Home Secretary and ministers like to talk tough, but the reality is they're soft on crime and soft on the causes of crime. And the results have been devastating for victims of crime right across the country. I mean, the Minister chuckles, but in fact, violent crime has risen in every single police force area. And in 2019-20, violence as a proportion of all police recorded crime reached its highest level since comparative records began. And the Home Office's own research has shown the link between cuts to police officer numbers and violent crime. And as a result, it is good the government has finally woken up to the huge damage their police cuts have done to public safety and started to replace some of the huge numbers of officers they have cut. However, it should not have taken the devastation that rising crime has caused to families and communities across the country to spark this action. In terms of the new recruits that are promised, I would call on the government to do everything possible to improve diversity in recruitment. I know all members of this House will agree that joining the police is a noble calling, and it's vital that police services look like the communities they serve. And that's one of the many lessons we need to learn from the powerful testimonies that so many black people have shared in the past 9 months, and it's incumbent upon us to act. There are excellent examples of initiatives to try and improve diversity, which it would be good to share across the country. Much more too needs to be done to ensure officers from black, Asian and minority ethnic communities rise through the policing ranks, and we must put in place better structures to enable greater community involvement in police training. Looking more widely across the criminal justice landscape, I will again call on ministers to properly commit to fully implementing the recommendations in the Lamy Review and indeed other reviews that the government's commissioned in recent years. It is vital that we all live up to the words uttered on building a more equal society. Does the honourable gentleman want me to give way?
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the honourable gentleman very much indeed for giving way? He suggests that the government is giving warm words to its commitment to the police, which I wholly disagree with. But should the Labour Party be in power, as we're seeing at the moment from the Mayor of London, who has very kindly given an exemption to emergency workers from the congestion charge in London, but not from police officers or police staff, I wonder whether he might share his view as to whether or not real prioritisation of the police is something the Labour Party indeed supports.
Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. It's nice to actually take an intervention. This is not something that we can do regularly in the House debates at the moment. But in terms of coming to the point that is raised by the honourable gentleman, is an attempt to criticise the Mayor of London. The Mayor of London has been taking action on violent crime. The rise in violent crime is right across the country. In terms of the issue of prioritising police officers for the vaccine, that's precisely the case that I'm putting to the government. And they have been putting warm words too on this. What I'm asking them to do is to make good on the warm words that I know they've been uttering to police representatives for some time. And I think we would all agree about the dangers that police officers put themselves in every day, which is why I'm asking for this action to take place. Moving back to the funding of the commitment on police recruitment. As ever with this government, the devil is in the detail, and the policing grant is no different. And I point out, first of all, that when the Prime Minister pledged to increase the number of police officers, he did not make clear to voters that a significant proportion of this would rely on increasing the council tax preset by £15 a year. And this at a time when family finances are so hard pressed. The Minister, in his opening remarks, described this as flexibility. I would describe it as a government that isn't putting the needs of families first. Now, can the Minister also confirm why it is that the government has decided to slow the speed of police recruitment so sharply? He'll be aware that police forces across the country were planning for 6,000 officers to be recruited in year 1, 8,000 in year 2 and 6,000 in year 3. However, we now know there'll be 6,000 officers this year and presumably 8,000 next year. What is the reason for this worrying slowdown that will leave thousands fewer officers on our streets? It will also not have escaped attention that there is a sharp decline in the amount of funding the government has allocated to recruiting the promised officers for this year. So when setting a target for 6,000 officers for 2020-21, the amount of money allocated was 750 million. But for 21-22, the amount for the same number of officers has sharply reduced to 400 million, again for 6,000 officers. Now, the Minister may say this is in part due to so-called front-loading of costs for additional officers. Indeed, he confirms that is what he indeed would say from a sedentary position. However, we know that in fact police forces have been incredibly stretched, and even with the promises of additional officers, there are huge budget pressures elsewhere, and that is why many forces have had to freeze police staff recruitment. Since 2010, there's been a fall of over 13% in police staff. Now, police staff, I'm sure the Minister would agree, across the board, play a vital role in keeping communities safe, in key roles like answering emergency calls to the public, staffing our custody suites, crime analysis and crime scene investigations. This also includes the loss of PCSOs who played such a vital role and play such a vital role in neighbourhood policing. Undermining all of these functions makes our communities less safe and keeps police officers behind desks and away from the streets where we want them to be. Little wonder that the number of police officers in frontline roles fell by 16% between 2010 and 2019. And these funding pressures are likely to be even more keenly felt when the required 120 million efficiency savings outlined in the Provisional Police Grant Report in December, indeed repeated by the Minister from the dispatch box today, come to pass. The fact that our brave officers are being forced to work with reduced numbers of colleagues and with a pay freeze is particularly galling at a time when such huge sums of money are being wasted on government inefficiencies. That's why the answer that was given to my honourable friend, the Shadow Policing and Fire Minister, at Home Office questions is so revealing. So poor, frankly, is Conservative management of the Home Office that delays to the emergency service network mean that police forces will have to spend an extra 600 million, bringing the total to 1.5 billion to replace the old radios whilst they wait even longer for new equipment. Although perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, we should not be surprised at the complacent attitude to serious errors at the Home Office or the impact that they can have. Members will have seen the deeply worrying statements and the lack of grip at the Home Office over the catastrophic loss of police data. A confused picture that's seen ministers contradicted by the MPCC letter and now an independent review having to be held to get to the bottom of what went wrong. But one thing is clear. Thousands of police records have been deleted and criminals will in all likelihood go free as a result of this fiasco. And frankly, more effective Home Secretaries than this one have gone for lesser mistakes on their watch. And these errors are not isolated incidents. They're part of a picture of ministers who've lost a grip on vital issues of national security. We've seen it over the failures on quarantine, the rises in violent crime, the failure to get a grip of the data deletion, and too often we fail to see the Home Secretary taking charge of these issues and delivering results. So today, we do welcome the fact that members across the House now all agree it's vital to at least start to fill in the hole created by the Conservative cuts to policing since 2010. But there are and do remain a number of worrying aspects, including the huge general financial pressures for the police, officers being forced off the streets to backfill for police staff, the slowing down of police recruitment. And we will judge the government by their actions on this, as people are fed up, frankly, of empty promises. So whilst we welcome the new police officers and staff joining the ranks, and we thank them for their service, we will continue to campaign for them to have the support they need to keep us all safe.
Philip Holloway.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to support the motion on the order paper and to thank the government for the extra money going into local policing. I thank the Minister for his endeavours. I think he's been a superb Minister for Policing. And also to highlight the excellent work done by Chief Constable Nick Adderley in Northamptonshire, Chief Fire Officer Darren Dovey, and our superb Police, Crime and Fire Commissioner Stephen Mould. And to thank all the police and fire officers in Northamptonshire for all the superb work which they do. But it's not enough to talk about just about how much extra money is going into policing this year. The important thing is to highlight what the police do with that money. And I'm pleased that as a result of the funding that's been announced, there are 57 new officers so far in Northamptonshire, taking the total police headcount to 1,300 and sending us well on our way to our ultimate target of about 1,500 in 2023. And I think it's just worth reminding residents in Northamptonshire that they pay on average a bandy council tax, on average £5 a week for their policing. And in return for a £5 a week, they get a tremendous range of police resources. Madam Deputy Speaker, with your permission, I wanted to concentrate on 4 particular issues that affect Northamptonshire. The first is county lines drug gangs. Secondly, automatic number plate recognition technology. Thirdly, assaults on police officers. And fourth, tasers. Now, Northamptonshire Police should be congratulated for the efforts they've undertaken over the last 2 years, especially in busting county lines drug gangs. And I think it was only last week it was reported in the national press that Northamptonshire was responsible for the biggest ever takedown of a UK narcotics network, when as a result of an extensive investigation over a long period of time, they managed ultimately to jail 72 gangsters who had been described as untouchable, with a total sentencing of 220 years. As a result of this drugs bust, 18 county lines and 12 local drug lines were busted, and £1.3 million of drugs taken from our streets. Disgracefully, Northamptonshire Police found these gangs exploiting vulnerable children as young as 14 to sell crack cocaine and heroin on local streets. And the 4 big players of the operation were jailed for a total of 36 years for conspiracy to supply drugs. Now, I think it's an immense source of pride for Northamptonshire Police that they should be responsible for this biggest ever county lines bust, and congratulations to Chief Constable Nick Adderley for the operation. It began at the beginning of 2019 and involved investigations in the East Midlands, the West Midlands, London and elsewhere. In fact, contacts were in London, Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Northampton and London. Warrants were made for multiple arrests at the end of 2019, taking those